you've never heard of a public policy advocate before, it's because I'm the only one in the LCMS that has that job description. That's not to say that a lot of districts aren't performing some of the functions that I do. Certainly they are. But to my knowledge, nobody has invested all of those things in one person or one position. So, for the last 5 years, it's been my pleasure to, first of all, to try to understand myself, the various dimensions of public policy that the church has historically spoken to, and then what that means now in the present circumstance. I could go on a long time just about that, but we won't. So far, at the conference, I have not heard mention of what is a very notable event that happened yesterday. How many of you are familiar with the newly released movie, Gosnell? Okay, you must see it, okay? You have to, and you must see it soon, because it's one of those movies that gets released, and depending upon what kind of a response there is on the part of people, that will largely determine how long it sticks around in various theaters. My wife Rachel and I saw it yesterday afternoon. It is powerful, not grisly in any sense, but very powerful, and so do see it. You know, to some degree, well, as we're celebrating here, our 40th anniversary of Lutherans for Life, the abortion issue has been around a long time. And because it's been around a long time, there is a certain degree of fatigue that sets in, you know, personally and institutionally. Every once in a while, something comes along to kind of reinvigorate that. A few years ago, it was those videos, undercover videos by David Daleiden. Those probably are going to resurface again. His court case, he personally has been tied up in the court of law for the last at least 2 years, not 3. That's coming to a head, and hopefully there are more tapes that we hope will be released then. But the second thing that's going to reinvigorate this, I believe, is this movie. If it gets a broad enough exposure. And I'm going to charge you with helping to give it that broader exposure by talking to others and so forth. If you're interested in what it's all about, I have a few copies, like 7 or 8 copies, that explains a little bit more about it. There's an LCMS person that is a pivotal figure in that movie. If any of you have heard of Molly Hemingway, she writes for the Federalist and is on TV frequently. She's actually the heroine of the movie. And so please do see it. We also passed out several other handouts. One is a copy of article from LifeSite. If you're not familiar with that website, get familiar. It is very, very good, helpful, timely, reliable. And this article in particular will give you, I believe, a new perspective on physician-assisted suicide and what it means for all of us. Yes.
Would you say the name of that movie again?
Gosnell, G-O-S-N-E-L-L, Gosnell, like Dr. Gosnell. That's the doctor from Philadelphia that was convicted. Yes, ma'am.
Who is behind this LifeSite website?
It's largely a Roman Catholic site. The specific persons I don't know, but I find it to be very reliable and very helpful. Also, I'll just point out one of the things, if I don't do it now, I'll forget it. We'll be mentioning a variety of different kinds of corruptions in our society these days. One of those is transgenderism. It is the current one, most current. And so in Minnesota, our Minnesota Family Council has produced a wonderful resource. I have a few copies of it here. It's called a parent's resource guide, but it's good for everybody, pastors and everybody else. So I just highly recommend it. And I have a few copies to share, but if you're interested, let me know. Okay. So, I doubt whether there is anybody here who was not riveted over the last 2 or 3 weeks at the spectacle that went on in Washington, D.C. Of course, that was all related to the nomination and now confirmation of Judge Brett Kavanaugh to be the next Supreme Court Justice. It was, as you all know, an ugly, rancorous spectacle in which we found the most dominant forces of our culture pitted against each other in a way that I don't think we've ever seen on display before. In it, those forces were unleashed to try and bring essentially a chaotic halt to our government, to try and intimidate and prevent our elected leaders from carrying out their deliberative duties, the senators in particular, and to literally attack the very fundamental political aspects, legal aspects of our nation. And so due process, the rule of law, presumption of innocence, all of those things were blatantly attacked in a way that I've never seen before. Now, in the midst of this chaos, and it is an ongoing chaos, it's my belief that we are, as the church, called, that we are given a special calling. And that special calling, I think, is well summed up in the words of St. Paul when he says in 1 Timothy, "I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth." Paul understood there was a direct connection between peacefulness and quietness in society and the ability to proclaim the gospel effectively. We now are entering, apparently, into a period of time in our national life where that peacefulness and quietness is going to be tested, and at least for the moment, it seems almost non-existent. But we as Christian people are called to do whatever we can to return back to that more peaceful, sedate way of being for the sake of the gospel. Okay? So, what does that mean? Well, among other things, I think it means that we, as Christians, have a calling to try and understand what's going on. Not just in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but over the last, 40 years, but I would say in particular over the last 10 or 15 years, as the number of social innovations, let's call them, have been coming at us fast and furiously. So we need to understand what's happening. And secondly, to begin to share with our fellow citizens and members of the church, so that finally we can begin to offer some help, some biblical insights that would help us as a nation begin to heal again, so that there might be a more unfettered proclamation of the gospel that happens. So it's with that hope in mind that I share with you some information that I've come across recently that I think will help us move down that road toward a more peaceful and quiet national life, and therefore a fuller proclamation of the gospel. So, first of all, it's important that I acknowledge where some of this material is coming from. Most of what I'm going to tell you is nothing original with me. If there is one resource that I would point you all to, it's a recent book by author Nancy Pearcey, Pearcey. It's called Love Thy Body, and it is absolutely superb. It's accessible to, I think, any educated person. You don't have to be a theologian or anything like that. So I would point you to that and really recommend that if you want to understand the current circumstance that we are in, socially, nationally, and so forth, this will be very helpful. There's a second resource. This one might, well, it's found in a publication called Touchstone. Touchstone, it's a superb publication on an ongoing basis. But in the current issue, October 2018, there's an article entitled Liberalism Occupied. It's by a professor from Macalester College in St. Paul. His name is Andrew Latham, Latham. And it is superb. So between the Nancy Piercy book and this article, that's really the bulk of what you're going to see here this morning. Okay, so of late we have had a steady stream of Supreme Court rulings that have really been quite remarkable, quite good, which is pretty shocking after many, many years, decades of court rulings that have been, I would say, unhelpful as far as the gospel is concerned. The first of these major Supreme Court rulings happened a little over a year ago, back in June of 2017. You probably have heard of the Trinity Lutheran ruling. It involved one of our LCMS churches from Columbia, Missouri. It is so important. And as we begin to understand it and its implications, it will become even more important. Essentially, what the Trinity Lutheran ruling did was to answer the question, may the government treat some of its citizens as second class based on the fact that they are religious? Can the government choose a certain group to offer certain benefits, or to deny certain benefits to, again, simply because they want to live their life in a religious framework and in a religious way? We have had a steady attack on the right of our freedom of religion, religious liberty, and this has gone a significant distance in preventing that, modifying this attack on our religious liberties. So the Trinity Lutheran ruling then set the stage for two or three others that came down just this past June. One of them is the Masterpiece Cakes decision. That, of course, involved the baker from Colorado who politely refused to design and create a work of art in celebration of a same-sex wedding. That, too, was a pretty powerful statement on the part of the court, which said, essentially, government, you may not treat religious people as second class. It could have been stronger. We're hopeful that the stronger dimension of that will be coming soon. And of course, the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh and Gorsuch and so forth promises to bring that. Also, this last June, there was a ruling, goes under the acronym NIFLA. And I always forget what it stands for. NIFLA, National Institute of Family and Life Advocates. It's basically a group of crisis pregnancy centers in the state of California, which were being told by the state of California, via some legislation that had been passed, that they had to become a mouthpiece for the abortion industry. They had to literally advertise for the abortion industry in California. And here too, the court came down very strongly, it affirmed our freedom of religion and, more specifically, our freedom of speech. In this case, freedom of speech being understood not as something that we're allowed to say, but that we cannot be compelled to speak something that we don't want to speak. Okay? So it too was very significant. And then one other case that I don't have listed here, the Janus case, which on the face of it doesn't seem like anything related to religious liberty, but it is. Janus case had to do with public employees, unions, and answers the question, can the government force you to belong to a union and pay dues, and in so doing, forces you to speak a political kind of speech that you don't want to? Again, it's a question of religion, freedom of speech. So, a number of very good things happening dealing with freedom of religion and freedom of speech. However, as important as those are, and they are, I'm convinced that there is an even more important issue at hand. And that's what we're going to speak about today. The question is there some kind of underlying issue, some kind of underlying movement in society that helps us understand, not in isolation, all of these innovations, abortion, same-sex marriage, transgenderism, surrogacy, all the things that have popped up, but is there something that underlies them all, which, if we could understand, would help us deal with all of them and avoid a great deal of frustration and fatigue as each of these things, comes at us one after another. Well, I believe there is such a thing. In a recent issue of First Things magazine, where they went through all of these court cases, in the end, the legal authors of that article had this to say, the very last sentence or two. They said, our cultural and legal conflicts are fundamentally over what it means to be human. This conflict, they said, the Supreme Court cannot resolve. So, while we are very thankful for what has happened, what has come from the courts, and that we anticipate will continue to come, these are not issues that are going to be solved in a court of law. These are cultural matters, and we need to understand what's undergirding the cultural change that's happened to us in recent years. All right, so what is this dispute that's taking place in our culture? Well, in a word, it is a dispute about our bodies. That is, whether they are important or not, whether they carry meaning or not, and, in fact, whether we as human persons, whether our body is an integral part of us or not. What's the real we? Okay? Does it include the body, or is the body just this shell in which the real you is carried? Okay? So it's answering questions like that which is in dispute. Now, it turns out that there are basically two different camps when it comes to answering these questions. A woman by the name of Camille Paglia would represent one of those camps. And she says about our bodies, fate, not God, has given us this flesh. We have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. Just nice and concise. She lays it out there, not beating around the bush at all. Anyway, she presents herself, in her own words, as a feminist pagan. That's how she sees herself, which kind of sounds right. Now, in contrast to that, an Episcopal Anglican theologian said this: Christians should confess their faith in the natural order as the good creation of God. We must cherish nature, defer to its laws, and plan our activities in cooperation with them. So a clear statement of what's typically called natural law, which we as Lutheran Christians certainly acknowledge as reality as well. So one holds up the physical world as a good creation of God, one completely denies that it is creation. And if you were to dig further, of course, you would quickly get into a discussion of evolution, Darwinian evolution. Okay, so this is the big dispute going on in our culture. It is the dispute, however, which yes, it plays out inside of courtrooms, but it also much more frequently plays out in other places a lot closer to where we live. In our homes, in our schools, churches, communities in general. And you are familiar with the way in which this plays out. Just a few, for examples. Don't know if you're aware of it, but with respect to the transgender movement, if it seems to you like there are a whole lot more people claiming to be transgender than there ever were in the past, you're right. And in fact, transgenderism has now moved into a realm that many people refer to as a contagion, an infection that is spreading and spreading rapidly. So, for example, there was a researcher from Brown University recently that published a study in which she talked to 250 parents who had children that had come out and self-identified as transgender. Turned out most of those, majority of those young people, their self-identity as transgender did not happen over a course of months or years, but rather developed over the course of days or weeks. And then when they dug a little bit deeper, they found out that they were, virtually all of them, were part of what they called friendship groups. And so within these friendship groups, it was not unusual to have 50 or 60% of the kids essentially identifying as transgender at the same time. Okay? Shocking. But that's the definition of a contagion. Spreads quickly. Also, in this study, she discovered that roughly 62% of those that claim a transgender identity already had underlying psychological issues. So what we begin to see is that transgenderism, this desire to declare yourself transgender, is really nothing more than another kind of coping mechanism for people who are already vulnerable, particularly in psychological ways. It's not unlike the coping mechanism that we assign to drugs or alcohol. Transgenderism functions in the same way for those people. So this strikes close to home, in our homes, in our schools, frequently these days. Don't know if you're aware of what's going on with respect to surrogacy. That is, one woman bearing a child for somebody else. The new form, surrogacy has always been around, typically done within families or something like that. But the new version of this is a commercial form in which you write a contract, a for-profit, a highly profitable contract, in which a woman agrees to carry a child for somebody else. Frequently, those are same-sex couples, not always, but it's one of the things that's driving this forward. That too, in most states, I can speak most directly to what goes on in Minnesota. Minnesota, there's not much in the way of commercial surrogacy happening because you can't write a contract for it. The state will not recognize a contract. What's happening in our legislatures is that people who favor this want to establish this in law so that contracts can be written and enforced. That's what brings an industry, a surrogacy industry, into being. And that's what's happening in essentially every state of the union. There are forces, two groups stand to benefit from this. The lawyers, there's a lot of money to be made in this, and same-sex community, because obviously they're sterile relationships. And so if they want to give the impression of that, I'm halfway through. Oh, golly. All right, so at any rate, we have all kinds of issues when LGBT folks enter our congregations, all of a sudden that brings this issue home very quickly. If they want to become members of our congregation, pastors, what are you going to do? What are you going to say? Are they children of God and welcome? Yes. But of course we understand there is baggage that comes along with that. So that becomes an immediate issue. Again, across the country, issues of physician-assisted suicide, which you heard a lot about this morning from Dr. Lamb. And of course, then transgenderism, as it inserts itself into the culture through our educational system, the public schools. You have no idea the degree to which the transgender ideology has infected public school system across the nation. It doesn't matter if you are in a rural setting or an urban setting, it is thoroughly infected by it. And if you want to read a book that really will bring this home, again, it's a very new book. It's called Get Out Now, and one of the authors is Mary Rice, R-I-C-E, Hasson, H-A-S-S-O-N. It will be an eye-opener for you. At any rate, all of these things, and many, many more, social corruptions, social innovations, have been coming at us recently, so that in the end, it kind of makes us feel like we're all playing this huge, endless game of whack-a-mole. Because of course, you know, when you hit one, you know, another one pops up, and it just goes on endlessly. In the end, it's a very fatiguing kind of thing. It might be exhilarating to begin with, but it gets old real fast, and you get very tired. So again, this is the kind of the nature of our life over the last, especially the last 5 or 10 years. All right, so as I mentioned before, if we could find that there is a common root to all of these, it would make this all much more manageable. Okay, we wouldn't feel like we're losing our minds after a while. And so the question is there such a common root? Well, of course, as Lutherans, we would be quick to say, well, sure, it's called sin. And that would be perfectly accurate. James, of course, sums it up nicely when he says, for where you have envy and selfish ambition, that is sin, there you find disorder and every evil practice. Okay, so that is helpful to know that it's sin. However, I think it would be more helpful if we could be more precise than that. If we could give some specific name to this underlying corruption that is driving all of this. Now, why is it important to, if we can, to find a common underlying issue here? Well, it's because, first of all, it'll help us personally get a grip on things. Okay, give us. Otherwise, we're constantly off balance, being hit by the next thing and the next thing, and so forth. And then, finally, it will help us formulate better strategies. All right, so is there a common root? As you might guess, I think there is. Okay, and the prime candidate for that is something that's been around a long time. It is ancient. It was labeled as a heresy right from the very beginning of the church. It actually existed before the Christian church came into being, but it is known as Gnosticism. Big word for a relatively simple idea. Those of you that are pastors or who have been trained have probably heard this word. I heard it, you know, in my church history courses and so forth. And frankly, it was kind of a little interesting at the time. But little did I understand, nor did most of us, I think, that we were living in a time of great resurgence for this particular heresy. All right, so what is this thing called Gnosticism? First of all, it is notoriously difficult to define. Gnosticism has existed for many hundreds of years. It tends to change its colors, tends to change its look, depending upon the kind of culture that it's surfacing in. Okay, but there are a few common things that we can say about it across time. First of all, it tends to be, as it says here, a mood. Okay? Something very difficult to get a hold of. And it is a mood that typically rejects the world. The physical world is seen as something to be dismissed. The physical world, our physical bodies, just something that we have to put up with. But they're certainly not important. Even more certainly, they are not meaningful. Okay? So that's kind of a common thread that runs through it. And then it also has a religious character to it, and that religious character is abstract, as it says here. It's more a habit of mind that can change and mutate over time. It's a lot like a virus, which from year to year it changes, and therefore it's difficult to attack. All right, but just to give you a few handles on the current kind of themes that Gnosticism, or as we would call it, neo-Gnosticism, the type that is present with us now. Where we as Christians confess that we have one triune God, Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifier, Gnosticism always tends toward self-deification. In the end, you become God. Okay? Also, whereas Christianity acknowledges God as sovereign, and I think Lynette Auk's message last night did a wonderful job of pointing that out. In contrast to that, the Gnostics stress the radical autonomy of each of us. We are all our own king, okay? We rule our own lives, and therefore we reject any authority outside of ourselves. Also, whereas for Christians, we confess every Sunday when we come together that we have all sinned, thought, word, and deed, and that we are captive in such a way that we cannot escape this ourselves. Gnostics confess the perfectibility of human nature and therefore human society. If we just try hard enough, if we just have the right way of thinking about this, we can pretty much bring heaven to earth. And then a fourth characteristic, and this is the one I'm going to emphasize the most today. Whereas Christians, and our Christian faith acknowledges that as human persons, we are the unity of body and spirit, body and soul. They are both equally important. Okay? A Gnostic tends to portray us as being dualistic. In other words, there's a radical division between the soul and the body. And then they go a step further, and they begin to compare these two things. And of the body, of the material world, they say it is evil, it is inferior, it is therefore unimportant and without meaning. As opposed to the spirit, the spiritual dimension, or if they don't acknowledge a spiritual dimension, then they'll speak of the mental instead. The mental is good, superior, important, meaningful. So clearly, the real you as a human being, as a person, resides in your spiritual or mental realm. It has essentially nothing to do with you physically. All right, so all that's interesting, but what does it have to do with our day-to-day life? Okay? Well, it has to do with our day-to-day life because it directly impacts the kind of culture in which we live. And a culture, one way of describing it, is this thing, this substance that we all exist and live in. We swim in it as a fish in water. Rarely are we aware of it, minute to minute, but it's what we all live in. in our culture, in a national culture, which is what we're kind of talking about here, a national culture is derived essentially from two sources. Typically, there is a political philosophy of some sort that is dominant, and then there is a religious element to it as well. We frequently refer to it as a civil religion because it's the kind of thing that everybody, regardless of your denomination, tends to share, and it's reductionist. It's the things that we all hold in common. Now, in the United States, that culture is composed of these two things: a political philosophy that we commonly know as liberalism, and the religious component has always been, at least historically, supplied by Christianity. Now, liberalism, classic liberalism, is by and large a good thing. It does things like emphasize the importance of the individual as opposed to the collective, all of us together. It tends to accentuate the moral equality of all of us. We are all equal in stature, at least in theory. That's the way it is. It tends to invest a lot of confidence in human reason, that we can, using our minds and our efforts, produce a better society than what preceded us. And it tends to emphasize freedom. A particular kind of freedom, not so much a freedom to be what we were made to be, but rather a freedom from external constraints. Now, in their place, at a certain level, all of these things are very positive, and we should be thankful that we live in a country in which they are emphasized. However, all of these things, when taken to extreme, become toxic. So, for example, liberalism, when it has no restraints attached to it, tends to produce what we might call an atomized world. And what that means is that we as individuals stand alone, absolutely alone, in the face of everything around us, in particular with respect to the government. Okay? All of what we would typically call them moderating or mediating institutions of life, like family, church, civic society, all of those things tend to get pushed out. They are unimportant and therefore diminished. And so then the natural bonds that are formed within those mediating institutions also begin to dissolve. And we see that all over in our culture. And then finally, again, these restraints, both internal and external. We tend to think mainly of external things, but the same thing is true of the kind of virtuous restraint that we would want to cultivate. That too gets pushed aside, and probably no better summary of all of that than the Nike admonishment to just do it. Okay? Now, for most of our nation's history, there has been a tension then between these liberal tendencies to excess and the Christian worldview. They have tended to keep each other in balance. In particular, Christian thought has tended to restrain the liberal excesses. So, for example, Christianity, our emphasis on natural law and a natural order, both in a physical and a social dimension. Okay? We understand that the physical laws, okay, how the periodic table and how everything is laid out and so forth, we understand that there's an order there. What we have tended to forget is that there is a social equivalent to that. And that's what, of course, is being denied wholesale these days. Also, the Christian faith emphasizes the sovereignty of God. He is the ultimate authority. We are not. The fixed and fallen nature of man There's a phrase that Andrew Latham quoted, which I thought is quite well known from antiquity, which simply says, "Out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight ever was made." And there, I don't know if you picked it up in Philippians 2:15 this morning in Pastor Lamb's address. There was a scriptural passage that refers to the crooked and twisted generation that we live in. So, we acknowledge that we are all twisted folks because of sin. We also emphasize the naturalness and the goodness of marriage and family, the naturalness and goodness of political communities, and we acknowledge that hierarchy is a good thing. It is embedded right in the structure of the Trinity itself, and therefore we should expect to see it in our lives, our personal lives, our social lives, political lives, and that kind of thing. So those are the dimensions of Christianity that tend to keep liberalism in check. You could think of this, the normal way of being in our culture, as a double helix, like the DNA molecule, the life-giving molecule, right? Typically, for most of our life, Christianity and liberalism have been entwined with each other, and it's been a life-giving relationship. What has happened recently, however, as Christianity has been weakened and marginalized in our society, those two strands have effectively been separated from each other. And if you know anything about organic chemistry, you know that kind of a circumstance cannot exist. The other one strand of the DNA molecule will attract another. It has to have a complementary strand attached to it. Problem is, it has lost, essentially, Christianity as that complementary strand, and what has replaced it is Gnosticism. And when that happens, in a social sense, this is what we get. Where Christianity is the brake that keeps liberalism from going to its natural state of excess, now you have Gnosticism replacing Christianity, and it has the same tendencies as liberalism. And so you've all seen pictures of a person whose foot slipped off of the brake and onto the accelerator. And this is what you get. And that, in essence, is what we're seeing again and again and again in our society. 5 minutes? Oh, that's cruel. All right, so, yeah, I know. All right, so what happens when Gnosticism rules? When matter, or the material world, no longer matters, when bodies are declared meaningless? Well, there are a number of disasters that quickly come, and we've witnessed all of these. Life ceases to have an inherently sacred nature. It's valuable only to the degree in which it is useful, okay, utilitarianism. And so abortion is a natural outcome of that, as is physician-assisted suicide. You're good only as long as you can contribute to the society. The point at which you start to draw more resources than you contribute, we'll wish you goodbye, and we'll all be better for it, they say. Also, you find that the very basic order of life, maleness and femaleness, is quickly rejected. Of course, we've seen that with same-sex marriage and with transgenderism. And people quickly become commodified. We are able to determine how much you are worth, dollars and cents. And we see that in, again, this push toward commercial surrogacy, writing contracts for preborn people. If it was a born person and you paid for it, of course it would be slavery, and we would all be aghast at that. But when you pre-ordered, then it's okay. Let that sink in. That's where we're headed. Well, that's where we are. Okay. And then, of course, the idea that you could sell bodies not just as a whole, not as whole specimens, but as parts. Well, of course, we've seen that as well in associated with Planned Parenthood and about the sale and purchase of body parts. Very quickly, disorder becomes the norm. Also, what very quickly happens is that there's a personal and societal perfection that is ruthlessly pursued. And here the key word is ruthless. So, for example, if you're going to create this new utopia in which the body means nothing and all you are is mind or spirit, then we have to re-educate you. We have to set about straightening you crooked timbers. Okay? And if that takes getting your attention by denying you a job or whatever it takes to get you re-educated, the culture will do that. We have to elevate a new group of leaders, elite leaders, or what we might call Gnostic leaders. Leaders who have a special understanding that the rest of us don't have. And we have to defer to them completely. You've seen it played out in Washington recently. We have to construct a new, more muscular state. If you're going to take these resisting elements, that's you by the way, and bring them into line, it will take a state that has some power, that can reinforce this new view of the world. Also, we're going to have to free you as individuals from these limiting influences that come from the mediating structures, family, church, civic organizations. We're going to have to separate you from them because they tend to pollute the way you think. Okay? And we're going to have to free the state from such old, antiquated notions as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, a true tolerance, and the idea of limited government. Government must be allowed to expand to encompass all. All of that's required if utopia is to be brought into being. There are a lot of folks that have jumped in and have dived into this head first. They are committed to it. The folks pounding on the doors of the Supreme Court building a few days ago would certainly be part of that group, and we've seen many other examples of that. There are others of us, like us, that are resisting this and saying, no, the thing that promotes real, true human flourishing is this long-standing relationship between liberalism and Christianity. And we have to move back to that, appreciate what we have. It plays itself out everywhere, churches, schools, in families, and so forth. All right, I have to get to these last slides. All right, so the question is, what can you do to help resist this infection of Gnosticism into our lives? First of all, whether you like it or not, there's a political dimension to this that you have to be aware of. It has been used as the lever, it has been used as the steamroller to impose this on everybody. So, you need to be politically active, and you need to help others understand what I've just shared with you now. Be informed, vote, that's certainly very important. We've got a big election, huge, coming up soon. In Minnesota, one of the things I do is to produce a Lutheran voter information guide. It doesn't talk about candidates, it talks about issues. And just very clearly and concisely for our members spells out what stand we as Lutheran Christians take on these key issues. And we need to teach our people to understand, to recognize when these kinds of Gnostic-inspired things pop up. Because this will not be the last, I'll guarantee you. We need to be very direct in challenging evolutionary thought, in particular Darwinian evolution, which is a very specific kind. We have to allow the creation to give its full witness. That's where natural law gets its power from. And as long as we allow our schools, largely, to infect our children with an evolutionary frame of mind, we will always be fighting a defensive battle. So we have to be very confident, know that the science stands behind us 100%. Okay? We have nothing to apologize for. And then to go about speaking where we have opportunity as individuals. All right. Okay, I get it. Anyway, we need to directly oppose Gnosticism in that way. And then finally, and most importantly, we simply need to recover the sense of being the church. What does that mean? First of all, be in prayer about this, particularly if you are in a situation in which you can lead public corporate prayer and help, well, pray the Lord's blessing as we try to resist this. One of the most powerful things we can do as a church, because we are a sacramental church, is to emphasize the sacraments. The sacraments is that very obvious place where the material and the spiritual meet. Okay? Just like in our bodies, we are a blend of the material and the spiritual. The same thing is true of the waters of holy baptism, the bread of wine of communion. We have to stand strong on that. We have to be sure and root our children deeply in God's Word, and that, in our present day and age, that means gaining parental choice in education. As long as parents are frozen out of this, as long as they become subservient to the state, which is the case right now, we will never succeed, or it will be much more difficult to succeed in breaking through this wave of Gnosticism. Speak winsomely, lovingly, and plainly about moral matters. We are not a moralistic church, but we have to draw a clear distinction between Gnosticism and Christianity. We need to emphasize the physicality of our faith, that is, the physical creation as a good thing of God. Genesis 1, it was good, it was good, it was good, it was very good. Okay? The incarnation, critical. That's not so hard. Okay? Our culture is kind of wrapped up in at least one form of Christmas anyway. But to use that, to emphasize the goodness of the material world, Jesus' physical death, his physical resurrection, his physical ascension. If there's one thing that we could do to start to turn this around, it would be to recover the celebration of the high festival of the Ascension, which in many places has disappeared. Jesus physically rose back to heaven, ascended back to heaven. He is embodied today and will come back in a physical body just like you will come back in a physical body, which of course is what Dr. Lamb was talking about earlier. And talk about, we need to avoid language which refers to death or seems to imply that death is somehow our friend. Has God used death, a very evil thing, to bring about something very good? Yes. But death can never be seen as a friend, something to embrace, which again, Dr. Lamb did a fine job of bringing up. We need to prepare to minister to people who are extremely confused. They have been, their view of the world, of the universe, in which the material world is essentially meaningless, that will take some real effort to help them recover a holistic view of the world and their own lives. And then finally, celebrate the complementarity of male and female. So, I dumped a whole lot of stuff on you, I know that. But it's really, really important. But this is the underlying stuff. If you understand it, you will understand all of these other corruptions. And you'll be much less frustrated than you were before. So, with that, I'm sure our time is up and more than up.